Hi everybody. So today we're going to continue with your respiratory system. We have discussed the pathway of air through your respiratory system where it ends up at your air sacs, which is known as the alveoli. To kind of clarify the alveoli, what you see in the pictures is basically the air sacs we discussed. The cells that form majority of the alveoli are the simple squamous epithelium, which are basically single layers of flattened cells, helping with the process of gas exchange in your lungs, between your lungs and your blood vessels. You also have a second type of cells, which are referred to as type 2 alveolar cells. These cells are considered to be cuboidal cells, and they produce something called surfactant, which help with reducing the friction as your alveoli are filled with air and then again deflate as the air leaves the lungs. Something else that you do need to notice is the number of the alveoli that are present inside the lungs. They number about 300 million alveoli per cell, which gives you a really significant amount of surface area. As you can see, that the number is about 1,500 square feet. This is a really large number, which ensures that the gas exchange effectively takes place. Because the larger surface area, the more effective your gas exchange will be. Here's another picture. This picture represents the movement of blood into the alveoli and then again blood leaving. So if you guys want to orient yourself, the blood vessel that comes originates from the right side of the heart. So the main branch would be the pulmonary trunk, which branches to eventually the pulmonary capillaries, where the gas exchange takes place. Blood goes from deoxygenated blood, which is blue, into oxygenated blood, which is represented as red color. Taking a look at your lungs, your lung is broken down to individual lobes. So your right lung is considered to be larger and is broken down to 3 separate lobes, superior, middle, and inferior lobes, compared to your left lung, which is only broken down to superior and inferior lobe. Do recognize that your left lung is going to be smaller because of the cardiac notch, where the apex of the heart basically goes into, and that causes the left lung to be smaller. Now, the other thing that you need to know is the separation for each of the lobes of the lung is done by a structure referred to as the fissures, which you can see here. So fissures are basically lines that separates the lungs individual lobes. If I want to separate the superior lobe on the right hand side from the middle lobe, the separation happens using a horizontal fissure. And separating those two lobes from your inferior lobe is done by this line, which comes in an angle, and that's called the oblique fissure. The oblique fissure is also present on the left line, separating superior from the inferior lobes. Do remember that the pointy part of the lungs is referred to as the apex, similar to what we learned about the heart. The flat portion of the lung on the bottom on either side is referred to as the base of the lung. And then again, the other thing that you need to know is the location where all of the blood vessels and the trachea and the bronchi come in or leave your lungs, which are these two regions, is referred to as the hilum. Now again, recalling from the information we learned on earlier this semester, there are 3 main structures that we discussed that contains a double membrane around them, and this double membrane is referred to as the serous sac or serous membrane. And in case of your lung, that double membrane is referred to as the pleura. Oh, well, sorry, don't know what happened. The double membrane is referred to as the pleura, which basically surrounds your lungs. Now, as far as the layers, the terminology is still identical. So in this picture, the blue lining that you see is the outermost layer, which connected to the rib cage. So this is your parietal layer, and it's labeled right here. You have the little gap, which is represented with light blue color. And then you have the inner lining, which is represented in pink, and that's your visceral pleura. Now, the gap that you have between these two membranes is referred to as the pleural cavity, and It is filled with a little bit of fluid referred to as the serous fluid. The job of this serous fluid is to ensure that the two membranes are basically get stuck together. The example that I want to give you is if you have two plates and you have a little bit of, let's say glass plates, and you have a little bit of water between those two. If you want to separate the top plate from the bottom one, you can't just lift up the plate because there's a suction as a result of the fluid between them. So if you lift up the top layer or the top plate, you also lift up the bottom plate. So same thing with these two membranes. These two membranes are stuck together by that little fluid that found inside the cavity. This ensures that anywhere your thoracic cage is increasing or decreasing in its size, or basically you're moving your chest outward or inward, your lungs also going to be moved with your thoracic cavity or thoracic cage, making sure your lung volume is changing with that. Now, if you recall, we talked about the concept of or functions associated with respiratory system. This is on the first slide of this PowerPoint. We talked about ventilation. Ventilation is broken down to inhalation and exhalation. You have external respiration, which is basically the gas exchange you will see between lungs and your blood. And I'll talk about that in more detail later on. And internal respiration is the gas exchange that takes place between blood and tissue. So if you want to associate these to basically your circulation, this one, the first one, which is your external respiration, is related to pulmonary circulation, and your internal respiration is associated with systemic circulation. So let's go ahead and look at some of the key concepts that you need to understand. So for the process of inspiration and inhalation and expiration to make sense. So first thing is that the relationship that exists between your volume and your pressure. So volume and pressure is this. So if you look at the first picture, you have a larger volume, and this implies that the molecules of air exert a small amount of pressure on each other, and as a result, the pressure is considered to be low. So basically, high volume implies low pressure. Now, if you take the same container and then basically limit the volume within that container, now the molecules are much closer together, which means they exert more pressure on each other, and therefore it builds up the pressure. So by decreasing the volume, there would be a build-up of pressure. This is really important because it helps you understand that when you think about your lungs and when you think about your rib cage expanding, your volume of your lung is increasing, and therefore the pressure inside the lung decreases. In an opposite scenario, where you have your rib cage basically moving inward, the volume of your lung is decreasing, and as a result, the pressure is building up. Now, a few more points that you guys do need to remember. First is the relationship that pressure has. You do need to remember that pressure always moves from high pressure to low pressure, and this process stops until you reach your equilibrium. So it's very similar to what we discussed for diffusion. Diffusion was movement of molecules from high concentration to low concentration until you reach equilibrium. Same concept applies to pressure, where molecules move from a higher pressure to a lower pressure until the equilibrium reaches. The other concept that you guys need to know is this. The atmospheric pressure, the area or the pressure that is found in your environment, is consistent. We shorthand that to ATM. And if you are staying in the same environment, that pressure is typically described as 760 millimeter of mercury. The pressure that's considered to be atmospheric pressure does not change just because people are breathing the air in and out. Okay, so you have absolutely no effect in your pressure of your environment. What affects the pressure of the environment is the altitude. So if you are gaining altitude, Okay? What happens, altitude, what happens is pressure decreases, and vice versa. If you decrease your altitude, the pressure increases. But under normal conditions, we're gonna assume that you're at sea level and that pressure is 760 millimeter of mercury. The other hand, you have pressure inside your lungs. So understand that when you're not inhaling or exhaling, the pressure of your lung is equal to the pressure of your atmosphere, which is 760 millimeter of mercury. Now, also understand that when I inhale, when I'm talking about the process of inhalation, your rib cage is expanding, which means the pressure inside your lung is going to drop. So it's going to be less than 760. So that pressure is 759. And when we're discussing exhalation, do you understand that the lung volume is decreasing, which means pressure is increasing, and therefore the pressure would be one number above 760, which is 761 millimeter of mercury. Now, keeping that in mind, let's talk about your inhalation and exhalation process. So there's two muscles that are involved in the process of inhalation and exhalation. One of these muscles is the diaphragm muscle that you see right here. This is the blue line. When the diaphragm relaxes, it's more of a dome shape you see right here in the blue line. When this muscle relaxes, however, when the muscle contracts, when diaphragm contracts, it actually have a more flattened region. So if you want to compare it, during expiration or relaxed diaphragm, the muscle is like this. However, when it's contracting, the muscle would be like this. But notice that the diaphragm moves downward when it contracts because it shortens. The other type of muscles that you have are the intercostal muscles. These are definitions is inter means between, costal means cartilage. Costal means ribs. So intercostal means basically between the ribs. So the muscles you guys see here, these muscles are identified as intercostal muscles, more specifically external intercostals. So let's take a look at the process of inhalation or inspiration. You start by doing two type of movement, two type of actions. You're gonna contract both your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, which means diaphragm is gonna go from that dome-shaped muscle to a flattened muscle. And then your intercostal muscle contraction is going to pull your rib cage outward. Now, both of these causes an increase in the thoracic cavity volume, right? Because you're moving them outward and downward. Now, remember that when your rib cage and diaphragm moves, because they're connected to the visceral pleura, you're also moving your lungs, which means your lung is also going to move outward and downward. And as a result, the lung volume will increase. If volume is increasing, pressure is going to decrease. So you will start with the pressure at 760 at the beginning. And as you expand the structures, what you end up with is you drop the pressure to 759. Now, this creates something called partial vacuum because outside is now 760 and inside is 759. So remember, air moves from high pressure, which in this case is your atmosphere, to your lungs, which is 759, the lower pressure. So air continues to move inside your lung until the pressure of your lung is equal to the pressure of your atmosphere, which is the magic number of 760. Now, if I want to talk about exhalation or expiration, the same concept applies as well. Now, reverse the process when we're talking about exhalation. So during inhalation, you contracted the muscles or respiratory muscles. So during exhalation, I'm going to relax and relax, which means diaphragm is going to go back to its dome shape, moves upward, and your rib cage is going to go to the resting position, which means it's going to move inward. Both of these changes causes the lung volume to decrease. And remember, decrease in volume means increase in pressure. So your original pressure is 760, but now you compress the lung, which means the pressure is going to build up to 761. Atmospheric pressure doesn't change, it's always 760, right? So air is now have a higher pressure inside your lung compared to your atmosphere. So pressure moves from a higher pressure, 761, to a lower pressure, which is 760. So as the air moves out of your lungs, you basically continue this process until the inside of the lungs and the atmosphere has the same pressure of 760, and that marks the end of your exhalation. You're more than welcome to watch the 2 YouTube videos that are attached to help you understand the process of inhalation and expiration in a little bit more detail. Here's the same picture that we discussed earlier. Do notice that expiration, because it's the process of relaxation of the muscle, is considered to be passive, which means you do not require energy to carry out your exhalation. However, if you start to do forced expiration, which means that you are taking air out of your lungs more than the usual normal breathing, it's referred to as forced expiration. And that is require additional muscles and is considered to be an active process. This requires internal intercostal muscles, another set of muscles that are found inside your between your rib cage, and then you have muscles inside your in the abdominal wall that are either on an angle. So if you're looking at this is the belly button. There's muscles that are coming on an angle on either side. These would be your oblique muscles. And inside, very inside, the internal wall of your abdominal, there are muscles that are going this way, which basically goes horizontal, and these muscles would be referred to as the transverse abdominis. These 2 muscles are going to be essential for the process of expiration if you are doing a forceful process. So we'll